The fluorescent lights in the free clinic flickered as they always did after 9 o'clock, casting shadows across the empty waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. I was wiping down the last examination table when the front door burst open with such force that the bell above it clattered against the frame instead of chiming. Rain swept in with the woman who stumbled through, her designer heels clicking frantically against the worn linoleum, her arms straining under the weight of a man who was barely conscious and bleeding all over her expensive coat. My exhaustion from the double shift evaporated instantly as my training kicked in, my eyes immediately finding the source of the blood that was dripping onto my freshly mopped floor. The man's left shoulder was soaked crimson, his white dress shirt ruined, and even from across the room I could see the telltale entry wound of a gunshot. My hand moved instinctively toward the phone on the wall, where the emergency numbers were taped, but the woman saw the movement and her voice cracked with panic. "Please," she gasped, struggling to hold the man upright as his head lolled forward. "No hospitals, no police. He'll die if you don't help him." I should have called the police immediately. I should have refused and directed them to the emergency room 3 blocks away. But I was looking at the man's face now, his features slack with unconsciousness, and despite the pallor of blood loss, he was strikingly handsome, in a way that seemed entirely out of place in my dingy clinic. He looked to be in his late 20s, with strong features and dark hair that fell across his forehead, and his clothes beneath the blood were clearly expensive, the kind of tailored fit that cost more than my monthly rent. The woman was crying now, her mascara running in black streaks down her cheeks, and I found myself moving toward them instead of toward the phone. I noticed the Cartier watch on the man's wrist, noticed the woman's Prada bag sliding off her shoulder, noticed that these were not the usual inhabitants of my neighborhood clinic, where I treated uninsured workers and homeless veterans. My student loans were 3 months behind. My electricity had been shut off twice this year, and I had been living on ramen and coffee for so long I had forgotten what a full meal felt like. But none of that mattered as the woman's desperate eyes met mine, and I saw something there that overrode every logical thought in my head. "Help me get him to the examination room," I heard myself say, moving to support the man's other side. The woman nearly sobbed with relief as we half carried, half dragged him down the short hallway, his expensive shoes leaving smears of rainwater mixed with blood across my floor, and I knew with absolute certainty that this decision was going to change everything. We laid him on the examination table and I immediately began cutting away his shirt with the medical scissors I kept in my pocket, my hands moving with the practiced efficiency of 6 years in emergency nursing, even as my mind raced through the implications of what I was doing. The wound was high on his left shoulder, still bleeding but not arterial, and as I grabbed gauze to apply pressure, I could see the exit wound on his back, which meant the bullet had passed through completely. "This is a through and through," I said, my voice steadier than I felt as I worked to control the bleeding. "He's lucky, but he needs real medical care, antibiotics, monitoring for infection." The woman had moved to the head of the table and was stroking the man's hair with trembling fingers, and I noticed her hands were perfectly manicured, her rings catching the flickering fluorescent light as she touched him with the tenderness of someone who loved him deeply. "You don't understand what you're asking," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, just do what you can here." I wanted to argue, but I was already pulling on gloves, already preparing the local anesthetic, and gathering what limited supplies I had for wound treatment. The examination room was cramped and poorly equipped compared to the hospital where I had trained, but I had learned to make do with less. And as I injected lidocaine around the wound site, I found myself falling into the familiar rhythm of emergency care. Outside, I could hear sirens wailing past, probably heading toward whatever violence had created the patient now lying unconscious on my table. And the sound made my hands pause for just a moment before I forced myself to continue. I irrigated the wound channel with saline, checking carefully for any retained bullet fragments or debris, my fingers steady despite the fear coursing through me. His skin was warm under my touch, his muscles well-defined beneath the expensive fabric of his ruined shirt, and I found myself noting details I had no business noticing. The platinum Rolex on his wrist, that probably cost more than my entire education, the custom tailoring of his pants with their Italian label, the woman's Hermes scarf that had fallen onto the counter, casually discarded despite being worth thousands. These were not street criminals or gang members. These were people who moved in circles I could only imagine, people with resources and connections, people who had chosen my shabby clinic not out of necessity but out of desperation to avoid official attention. I worked efficiently, cleaning and closing the wounds with careful sutures, my training taking over even as my mind catalogued every expensive detail that screamed danger and money and trouble. The woman watched my every movement with fierce attention, and I could feel her assessing me, judging my competence, deciding whether I could be trusted with whatever secret had brought them here, bleeding and desperate into my clinic at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night in the rain. I was halfway through bandaging the exit wound on his back when his hand shot up and clamped around my wrist with a strength that made me gasp. His grip was like iron despite the blood loss, despite the trauma his body had just endured, and suddenly those gray eyes were open and locked onto mine with an intensity that stopped my breath in my throat. They were the color of storm clouds, piercing and intelligent and completely focused on my face, as if he could read every secret I had ever kept just by looking at me. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough with pain, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority that made the cramped examination room feel suddenly smaller. I tried to pull my wrist free, but his fingers only tightened. Not enough to hurt, but enough to make it clear that he could hurt me if he chose to. And I saw the woman move in my peripheral vision, making some kind of warning gesture that I could not interpret. "The person saving your life," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Now let me finish, or you'll bleed out." Something flickered in those gray eyes, surprise maybe, or amusement, and his lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Bold," he murmured, but he released my wrist and settled back against the table, his gaze never leaving my face as I returned to my work with hands that trembled slightly now. I could feel him watching me as I secured the bandage, could feel the weight of his attention like a physical touch across my skin, and the air in the small room seemed to thicken with a tension I did not understand. He was even more striking awake, his features sharp and aristocratic despite the pallor of blood loss, the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers or movie screens rather than bleeding on a table in a free clinic. His scrutiny was predatory, assessing, the look of someone who was used to evaluating threats and opportunities with equal calculation. I found myself hyper-aware of every movement I made, every breath I took, as if I were being catalogued and measured against some standard I could not comprehend. The woman had relaxed slightly when he woke, her hand going to his free one and squeezing it, and I saw the way his fingers curled around hers, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the dangerous intensity he had turned on me. "You need antibiotics," I said, stepping back to pull off my gloves and dispose of them. "Pain medication. Rest. And you should really be in a hospital where they can monitor you properly." His eyes had not left my face, and I found I could not look away from them, trapped in that gray gaze like a butterfly pinned to a board. "What I need," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of command that raised goosebumps on my arms, "is for you to tell me your name." I moved to the small desk in the corner to document the treatment in my logbook, a habit ingrained by years of nursing protocol, even though every instinct told me this was one patient record I should never put to paper. My pen was hovering over the blank page when I saw his entire body tense, his head turning sharply toward the window, despite the pain the movement must have caused. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but through the water-streaked glass, I could see headlights cutting through the darkness, multiple vehicles pulling up to the curb outside my clinic, with the purposeful precision of people who knew exactly where they were going. The woman saw them at the same moment, and her gasp cut through the room like a knife. "Dante," she breathed, her voice high with terror. "They found us." He was sitting up before I could process what was happening, moving with a speed that should have been impossible for someone who had just been unconscious from blood loss. And suddenly he was no longer a patient but something else entirely. His gray eyes had gone cold and hard, his entire demeanor shifting from injured man to someone who commanded armies. And when he turned that gaze on me, I felt pinned in place by the sheer force of his will. "Shut off the lights and don't leave," he said, his voice low and absolutely certain, carrying the weight of someone who expected instant obedience. "I need to," I started to say, my hand still holding the pen, my mind still trying to catch up to the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "You need to stay silent and stay alive," he cut me off, swinging his legs off the table and moving toward me with predatory grace despite his injury. "Shut off the lights, now!" The command in his voice overrode every rational thought, and I found my hand reaching for the light switch before I had consciously decided to obey. The fluorescent tubes went dark, and the room plunged into shadow broken only by the ambient glow from the street. And through the window I could now see men emerging from the vehicles, their silhouettes sharp and purposeful as they moved toward my clinic door. Dante had pulled the woman behind the examination table, and now his hand closed around my arm, drawing me down beside them, and I caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with blood and rain. His face was inches from mine in the darkness, and I could see the dangerous intelligence in those storm-gray eyes, the absolute focus of a predator who had just realized he was being hunted. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone in the room could hear it, and as footsteps approached the clinic entrance, I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple gunshot wound. The expensive clothes, the secrecy, the way this woman had called him Dante, as if the name itself carried weight and meaning, all of it crystallized into one horrifying realization. I had just saved the life of someone very dangerous, and now I was crouched in the dark with him while armed men searched for him outside, and there was absolutely no way I was walking away from this unchanged. Dante pulled me down behind the examination table with a controlled urgency that left no room for hesitation, his body immediately positioning itself between me and the door, and I found myself pressed against his chest with my heart hammering so violently I was certain it would give away our position. His hand came up to the back of my head, cradling it against him in a gesture that was both protective and commanding, and I could feel the tension in his muscles as he prepared to move, despite the fresh bandages now pressed between us. The clinic door opened with the creak I had been meaning to oil for months, and heavy footsteps echoed across the linoleum floor I had mopped just an hour earlier, when my biggest concern had been whether I could afford groceries this week. "Breathe quietly," Dante whispered directly into my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "Trust me. Trust him. Trust a man whose name I had learned only moments ago, a man who was clearly involved in something dangerous enough that armed men were now searching my clinic in the middle of the night. But even as my mind screamed the insanity of it, I found myself nodding against his chest, because some primitive part of me recognized that I was alive in this moment, specifically because he was here. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, at least 3 men moving through the waiting room, and then the woman, Isabella I would later learn was his sister, called out from somewhere near the front desk with a voice that shook just enough to sound authentically frightened. "Please, I just came in to use the phone," she said, her expensive heels clicking as if she were backing away from them. My car broke down in the rain. I saw the lights were still on. Through the gap beneath the examination room door, I could see shadows moving, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, and the smell that reached me was not just antiseptic anymore, but something else, something metallic and dangerous, like gunpowder and violence. Dante's other hand had moved to his waistband, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that he was armed, that he was prepared to shoot his way out of this situation despite his injury, despite being outnumbered, despite the fact that I would be caught in the crossfire. His body was coiled tight as a spring against mine, every muscle tensed and ready, and I could feel his heartbeat under my cheek, steady and controlled in a way that mine absolutely was not. The examination room door handle turned and my breath stopped entirely, but Isabella's voice rose higher, more panicked, something about her purse being in her car and needing help, and the footsteps paused, redirected. I heard muttered conversation in a language I did not recognize, heard Isabella's continued protests growing fainter as she apparently led them back toward the front entrance, and through it all, Dante remained absolutely still above me, a statue carved from muscle and determination and barely restrained violence. The streetlight filtering through the blinds cast bars of shadow across his face, and I could see his jaw clenched, see the dangerous focus in his eyes as he tracked the sounds of the search, and I understood that I was witnessing someone in his element, someone for whom this kind of danger was not an aberration, but a way of life. The sound of car doors slamming and engines starting filtered through the windows, and only when the last vehicle had pulled away did Dante finally release me and move to peer through the blinds with the caution of someone who had learned not to trust apparent safety. Isabella returned moments later, her designer coat soaked through and her carefully applied makeup smeared beyond repair, and the way she went immediately to Dante and pressed her forehead against his uninjured shoulder told me more about their relationship than words could have. "We need to leave," Dante said, his voice still carrying that note of absolute command as he turned from the window to look at me. "Now. All three of us." I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of the examination table as if it could anchor me to the life I knew. The life that had existed just 2 hours ago before this strikingly handsome stranger had bled all over my floor. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, hearing the tremor in my own voice. "This is my clinic. I have patients who depend on me. I saved your life and now you need to leave." He crossed the small room in 3 strides despite his injury, and suddenly he was looming over me, those gray eyes cold and calculating in a way that made my earlier fear seem quaint. "I saved your life," I repeated, lifting my chin to meet his gaze, even though everything in me wanted to step back. "That doesn't mean you own me." "No," he agreed, his voice dropping to something soft and infinitely more dangerous. "But it means I owe you protection. They'll come back. They'll find evidence you helped me. Blood on your floor, bandage wrappers in your trash, security footage if you have cameras. And they'll use you to find me." I looked around my clinic, this space that had been my sanctuary for 3 years, where I had treated hundreds of patients who had nowhere else to go, and suddenly it felt violated, contaminated by whatever violence Dante had brought through my door. The antiseptic smell I had always found comforting now mixed with the copper tang of his blood, and I could see the smears on the linoleum where we had dragged him in, the ruined shirt I had cut off him crumpled on the counter, all the evidence of my involvement in something I did not understand. "You don't know that they even saw this place clearly," I tried, but even I could hear how weak the argument sounded. Isabella made a small sound of distress. "They questioned me about where I had been," she said quietly. "They know someone helped him. They know it was nearby." Dante's hand came up to cup my face with surprising gentleness, his thumb brushing my cheekbone, and the contradiction between his touch and the coldness in his eyes made my breath catch. "You seem like a smart woman," he said, "smart enough to understand that your life changed the moment you decided to help me instead of calling the police. I'm offering you a choice. Come with us where I can protect you, or stay here and wait for them to return. But understand that if you stay, you die, and your death will be my fault, something I'm not willing to accept." I found myself in the back of a black Mercedes within 10 minutes, my medical bag clutched to my chest like a shield, the only thing I had managed to grab before Dante had ushered us out the back entrance of my clinic into the rain-soaked alley. The driver was a mountain of a man who had appeared from nowhere, his face impassive, and his suit perfectly tailored despite the late hour. And he had not spoken a single word as he held the door open for us, with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly. Isabella sat beside me, her hand reaching out to squeeze mine in what I supposed was meant to be a comforting gesture, while Dante occupied the front passenger seat and spoke in low tones on a phone in that same language I had heard the searchers using. "I'm sorry you're involved," Isabella said softly, her voice carrying genuine regret. "My brother, he doesn't make idle threats. If he says you're in danger, you are." I turned to look at her, this woman with her designer clothes and her tear-streaked makeup and her obvious devotion to the dangerous man in the front seat. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice coming out harder than I intended. "What are you people?" She opened her mouth, closed it again, glanced toward Dante's back as if seeking permission, but he was still absorbed in his conversation. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my scrubs, and I pulled it out to see 3 texts from my roommate asking where I was, whether I would be home tonight, if I wanted her to save me dinner. My fingers trembled as I typed out a lie about staying late at the clinic to finish inventory, about probably sleeping on the cot in the back office, about not waiting up for me. The ease with which the deception came frightened me almost as much as the situation itself, as if I had already accepted that my old life was something I now had to lie about. Through the rain-streaked windows, I watched my neighborhood blur past, the familiar streets where I bought my groceries and did my laundry and lived my small, quiet life. And then we were crossing into parts of the city I only ever saw from bus windows. The buildings grew taller and more elegant, the streets wider and cleaner, the cars parked along the curbs, worth more than I would earn in 5 years. The contrast between the luxury leather seats beneath me and my blood-stained scrubs was almost absurd, and I was suddenly conscious of how I must look, exhausted and disheveled, and completely out of place in this world of silent drivers and expensive cars. Anger warred with fear in my chest. Anger at Dante for dragging me into this. Anger at myself for not calling the police. Anger at the universe for putting that choice in front of me in the first place. But beneath the anger was something else. Something I did not want to examine too closely, a strange electric awareness of Dante's presence in the front seat. The memory of his body shielding mine. The way his hand had cradled my head with such unexpected gentleness, even as he prepared to kill to protect us both. The gates that opened for us were wrought iron and at least 12 feet high, cameras visible on every post, and the driveway that stretched beyond them was longer than the entire street where my apartment building stood. The mansion that rose out of the manicured grounds was all glass and steel and modern lines, nothing Gothic or ostentatious about it. Just clean, elegant architecture that whispered rather than shouted its wealth, and I counted at least 4 men patrolling the perimeter before we even reached the front entrance. Dante had barely spoken during the drive beyond issuing instructions to the driver, but now he turned in his seat to look at me with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through my exhausted defenses. "Elena will show you to your room," he said, and it was not a request. "Rest. We'll talk in the morning." A woman appeared as if summoned, 60 or so, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled at me. She wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary and carried herself with the dignity of someone who had worked in this house for decades. "Mr. Moretti asked me to make you comfortable," she said, her accent placing her as Italian, perhaps from the same region as Dante based on the similar inflection. "You're safe here, dear." I followed her through rooms that could have been featured in architecture magazines, all soaring ceilings and carefully curated art. My blood-stained scrubs, leaving me feeling like an intruder in a world I had no business inhabiting. The guest suite she led me to was larger than my entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked gardens even more immaculate than the front grounds, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Safe," I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "Or trapped." Elena's smile turned sad and understanding as she set down a tray I had not noticed her carrying, steam rising from a delicate china teapot. Sometimes they're the same thing, she said quietly, pouring amber liquid into a cup that probably cost more than my student loan payment. But I've worked for the Moretti family for 30 years, and I can tell you that Dante is a good man in a world that doesn't always allow for goodness. I sank onto a sofa that was more comfortable than my bed at home, exhaustion crashing over me now that the adrenaline had faded. Elena had laid out clothes on the bed, simple but clearly expensive, in exactly my size, which meant someone had assessed me with frightening accuracy. "There's a bathroom through that door," Elena continued, gesturing to what I assumed would be another space larger than my bedroom. "Clean towels, toiletries, anything you need. I'll bring breakfast at 8 unless you'd prefer to sleep later." She moved toward the door, and I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. "Am I a prisoner here?" She paused, her hand on the doorframe, and when she looked back at me, there was something infinitely sad in her expression. "You're under Dante's protection," she said, "which means you're the safest person in this city tonight, and the most trapped." Sleep was impossible in that luxurious bed with its silk sheets and down pillows that should have been heaven after years of sleeping on a second-hand futon, but instead, I lay there for 2 hours staring at the ceiling and feeling the walls of my gilded cage pressing in around me. Finally, I threw back the covers and pulled on the cashmere robe Elena had left folded at the foot of the bed, storming out of my room with no clear plan beyond demanding answers from the man who had upended my life. A guard was stationed in the hallway, young and alert and entirely unsurprised by my appearance, and when I told him I needed to see Dante, he simply nodded and led me through the silent house to a door at the end of another corridor. The study beyond was everything I would have expected, all dark wood and leather, and the kind of masculine elegance that spoke of old money and older violence. And there was Dante at a massive desk with papers spread before him and a glass of amber liquid at his elbow. He had removed his shirt, and I could see my bandage work already staining red at the edges where he had clearly been moving too much, his muscular torso marked with other scars that told stories of violence survived. "You're reopening the wound," I said, my medical training overriding my anger as I crossed the room without invitation. "Sit down before you pass out." He looked up at me with those gray eyes reflecting the firelight from the hearth, and something like amusement flickered across his features. "Concerned for me, Dr. Chen?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of that dangerous charm I had glimpsed earlier. "It's Nurse Chen," I corrected sharply, moving to examine the bandage despite every rational thought telling me to keep my distance. "And I'm concerned about my work being wasted." His skin was warm under my fingers as I carefully peeled back the dressing, and I could feel him watching my face with that same predatory focus that had pinned me in place at the clinic. "You investigated me," I said, not making it a question because the cashmere robe in exactly my size had already told me the answer. "The clothes in my room, they fit perfectly. That doesn't happen by accident." "Of course I investigated you," Dante replied calmly, not even having the decency to sound apologetic. "You treated a gunshot wound without calling the police. That makes you either very stupid or very interesting. And I needed to know which." The bandage came away and I could see fresh bleeding from where sutures had pulled. Nothing critical, but enough to require attention. "I need supplies," I said, stepping back and crossing my arms. "Proper medical supplies, not whatever limited stock you have in a first aid kit." He reached for his phone without taking his eyes off me and spoke a few words in Italian, then set it down and gestured to a leather sofa near the fireplace. "Elena is bringing everything you requested from your clinic," he said. "I sent someone to collect your supplies an hour ago." Elena arrived with a medical kit that was far more comprehensive than anything I kept at the clinic, and I found myself wondering what kind of household kept hospital-grade supplies on hand before deciding I probably did not want to know the answer. I set to work cleaning Dante's wound again, my fingers steady despite the questions racing through my mind, and I was hyper-aware of how close I had to stand to reach his shoulder properly, close enough to smell the expensive cologne that still clung to his skin beneath the copper scent of blood. You're going to tell me the truth now, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument as I irrigated the reopened sections of the wound. All of it. Who you are, who those men were, what I've gotten myself into. Dante was silent for a moment, and I could feel the muscles of his shoulder tense under my fingers as if he were deciding how much to reveal. My name is Dante Moretti, he said finally. I lead the Moretti family, which I assume means something to you, even if you pretend it doesn't. I kept my expression neutral, even though my heart had started racing again, because yes, I knew that name. Everyone in this city knew that name, even if they pretended not to. The kind of name that appeared in newspapers with words like alleged and suspected, but never actually charged. The men who came to your clinic tonight work for the Colombo family, he continued. They've been trying to take our territory for the past year, and tonight they nearly succeeded in taking my life. The bullet was meant to kill me, but Isabella pushed me at the last second. My hands continued their work, cleaning and resuturing with practiced efficiency, even as I processed the fact that I was currently touching a Mafia boss, that I had saved a Mafia boss, that I was standing in a Mafia boss's mansion at 2 in the morning, tending his wounds. They want more than territory, Dante said, and something in his voice made me look up from my work to meet his eyes. They want a USB drive I have, one containing evidence of their human trafficking operations. I was bringing it to the FBI when they ambushed us. You're working with the FBI? I heard myself ask, the surprise evident in my voice. His lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. I'm working to bury my family's enemies, he said. The FBI is convenient. They get arrests and headlines. I get the Colombos removed from power. Everyone wins, except the people being trafficked, I said sharply, tying off a suture with perhaps more force than necessary. They win most of all, he agreed, his gray eyes holding mine. Which is why I need to stay alive long enough to deliver that drive. Which is why I need you. The intimacy of the moment struck me suddenly, standing between his legs as he sat on the sofa, my hands on his bare skin, his face tilted up toward mine, and I could see approval in his expression as he noted how steady my hands remained despite the shocking revelations. I woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and for several disorienting seconds, I could not remember where I was or how I had gotten there. My hand reaching automatically for the alarm clock that should have been on my bedside table, but finding only smooth, expensive wood instead. The events of the previous night came rushing back as I sat up in sheets that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and I was struck by the surreal nature of my situation, how just 12 hours ago, my biggest concern had been whether I could afford both groceries and electricity this month. A soft knock at the door preceded Elena's entrance, and she carried a tray laden with more food than I typically ate in an entire day, fresh fruit and pastries and eggs prepared in a way that suggested a professional chef in a kitchen somewhere in this sprawling mansion. "Good morning, dear," she said with that maternal warmth that seemed genuine, despite the bizarre circumstances. "I hope you slept well. Mr. Moretti asked me to inform you that he's arranged for your shifts at the clinic to be covered for the next week, family emergency." I stared at her as she set the tray on a table near the windows, my mind catching on the casual way she delivered this information, as if it were perfectly normal for Dante to simply rearrange my life without consultation. "He arranged my shifts," I repeated slowly. "He called my supervisor." Elena poured coffee from a silver pot, and the rich aroma filled the room. "He thinks of everything," she said, and there was something like pride in her voice. "That's not comforting," I said, throwing back the silk duvet and standing on legs that felt unsteady. "That's controlling." "No," Elena agreed, her expression understanding. "But it keeps people alive." I moved to the bathroom while she arranged my breakfast, and found myself in a space that was larger than my bedroom at home, all marble and glass with a rainfall shower that had at least 6 different settings and towels so thick and soft they felt like clouds. After showering, I returned to find Elena gone and the closet door open, revealing an array of clothes that definitely had not been there last night. They were all in my size, perfectly tailored designer pieces that would have cost thousands, and as I ran my fingers over a cashmere sweater in deep emerald green, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Dante had done this, had studied my body closely enough during our brief interactions to know my exact measurements, had taken the time to stock an entire wardrobe for me while I slept. The attention to detail was disturbing in its intimacy, the implication that he had been assessing me so thoroughly even as I had been focused on saving his life. I chose jeans and a simple silk blouse because they seemed the least presumptuous, but even as I dressed, I could not shake the feeling that my autonomy was being stripped away piece by piece, replaced by the gilded cage of Dante's protection and control. I found Isabella in the gardens after breakfast, kneeling among roses that were still blooming despite the late season, her hands bare as she pruned dead blooms with the careful attention of someone who found peace in the work. She looked up as I approached, and her smile was genuine, if tinged with exhaustion, and in the morning light, I could see what I had missed in the chaos of last night. The fading yellow-green of old bruises along her jawline, the way she moved her left arm with careful deliberation, as if it had been injured and was still healing. "I'm sorry about last night," she said, sitting back on her heels and brushing soil from her hands. "About dragging you into our mess." I lowered myself onto a nearby stone bench that probably cost more than my car, aware of the guard I could see patrolling near the far wall, aware of the cameras I had spotted hidden among the landscaping. "Dante says I was already in danger the moment I helped him," I said, "that the Columbos would come after me." Isabella's expression grew somber as she returned to her roses. "He's right," she said quietly. "They're not like Dante. They don't have limits, don't have codes. When my husband," her voice caught slightly, "when Antonio started hurting me, I had nowhere to go. He was connected, powerful. The police wouldn't help. My family had disowned me for marrying him, but Dante came for me anyway." She looked up at me, and her dark eyes were fierce despite the evidence of violence still marking her skin. "He walked into Antonio's house with 4 men and carried me out. Antonio tried to stop him, and Dante broke his arm in 3 places. Told him if he ever came near me again, he would do worse." The image was vivid and disturbing, this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s using calculated violence to protect his sister, and I found my view of him shifting in ways I was not entirely comfortable with. "Codes don't make kidnapping right," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Isabella stood and moved to sit beside me on the bench, her shoulder touching mine in a gesture of solidarity. "He didn't kidnap you," she said firmly. "He saved you. There's a difference." "Is there?" I asked, looking around at the beautiful grounds with their hidden security, at the armed men who moved with military precision, at the walls that kept the world out and me in. "When the result is the same, does the motivation matter?" Isabella was quiet for a moment, following my gaze to where another guard was making his rounds. "Yes, his world is violent," she said finally. "Yes, he makes decisions for people without asking. But he has a code, Mia. He protects what's his. He honors his debts. And he would die before letting harm come to someone under his protection." I wanted to argue, wanted to maintain my righteous anger at being pulled into this world, but I kept remembering the way Dante had positioned himself between me and danger, the way his hand had cradled my head with such unexpected gentleness, the approval in his eyes when my hands had remained steady despite fear. The knock on my door came just after midnight, urgent and insistent, and I opened it to find one of Dante's men, his face tight with concern in a way that immediately set my pulse racing. "Mr. Moretti needs you," he said without preamble, and I was grabbing my medical bag before I had consciously decided to move, following him through darkened corridors to a set of double doors at the far end of the house. The master bedroom beyond was masculine elegance personified, All dark wood and deep colors with windows that overlooked the city lights spread below like scattered diamonds. But I barely registered the decor because my attention was fixed entirely on Dante. He lay in a massive bed that should have dwarfed him but somehow did not. His skin flushed with fever and sheened with sweat, and even from the doorway I could see the tremors that shook his muscular frame. His wound had become infected despite my careful treatment, and I felt a spike of professional concern, mixed with something more personal that I did not want to examine. I moved to his bedside and pressed my hand to his forehead, finding him burning with fever that had to be at least 103, and when I peeled back the bandage, I could see the telltale redness and heat of infection spreading from the wound site. Elena appeared with supplies I had not asked for but desperately needed, antibiotics and IV equipment and cold compresses, and I fell into the familiar rhythm of emergency nursing. Dante was delirious, his gray eyes unfocused and glassy, and as I worked to start an IV line in his arm, he began to speak in broken fragments that made my chest tighten. "Sophia," he mumbled, his hand reaching out for something that was not there. "I couldn't save you. I'm sorry. I couldn't save you." "I'm not Sophia," I said softly, smoothing the hair back from his forehead in a gesture that was more intimate than professional. "I'm Mia. Stay with me, Dante. Stay with me." His eyes focused on my face for just a moment, lucidity breaking through the fever, and what I saw there was so raw and vulnerable that it stole my breath. "Mia," he repeated, his voice rough and low. "Beautiful name. Beautiful woman." Then the fever claimed him again, and I spent the rest of the night at his bedside, monitoring his temperature and adjusting his IV fluids and watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. There was something profoundly intimate about caring for someone through the night, about seeing them stripped of all defenses and pretense. And as the hours passed, I found myself studying the planes of his face, the scars that marked his body, the evidence of a life lived in violence. Somewhere around dawn, his fever finally broke, and his breathing eased into true sleep, and I realized I was holding his hand without remembering when I had reached for it, my thumb tracing circles on his wrist, where his pulse beat strong and steady. I woke to the sensation of being watched, and my eyes opened slowly to find myself not in the chair where I had fallen asleep, but in Dante's bed, the sheets still warm from where his body had lain through the night, and he was sitting in the chair I had vacated, dressed in loose pajama pants and nothing else, his fever-bright eyes replaced by clear gray ones that tracked my every movement with predatory focus. "You carried me," I said, my voice rough with sleep as I pushed myself upright, hyper-aware of how intimate this was. Waking in his bed with morning light streaming through the windows and the scent of his cologne on the pillow beneath my head. "You needed to rest," he said simply, his voice still carrying a hint of the hoarseness that came from fever. "You sat with me all night." I could see the IV line still taped to his arm, and the fresh bandage Elena must have applied while I slept, and I felt a flutter of relief that he was clearly recovering, that my treatment had worked, that I had not lost a patient in the most unconventional house call of my career. "Last night you called for someone named Sophia," I said, deciding that exhaustion had stripped away my usual filter. "Who is she?" Something shifted in his expression, a flash of pain quickly controlled, and for a long moment I thought he would not answer. "My fiancée," he said finally, each word carefully measured. "She died 3 years ago, in crossfire meant for me. The Columbos killed her." The starkness of the statement hit me like a physical blow, and I found myself moving without thinking, leaving the bed to kneel beside his chair, my hand covering his where it rested on the armrest. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being because I understood loss, understood the way it hollowed you out and left you functioning, but never quite whole. Dante's hand turned under mine to grip my fingers with surprising strength considering his recent fever, and when he looked at me, his eyes were chips of gray ice with fire burning beneath. "Don't be sorry," he said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. "Help me destroy them." The request was so raw, so honest, that it bypassed every rational objection I should have raised, and I found myself nodding before I had fully processed what I was agreeing to. In that moment, sitting on the floor of his bedroom in yesterday's clothes, with our hands intertwined, I saw him not as the dangerous Mafia boss who had upended my life, but as a man who had lost someone he loved, who carried that loss like a weight he could never put down, who was trying to build something meaningful from the ashes of violence. He was strikingly handsome, even with the pallor of recent illness, those late-20s features, marked by both youth and the kind of hardness that came from seeing too much too soon. And I realized with a jolt that my fear of him was transforming into something far more dangerous, something that felt disturbingly like understanding, and the first stirrings of trust. We met in his study that afternoon, after he had rested, and I had finally changed into fresh clothes. And I found him behind his massive desk, looking every inch the powerful man he was, despite the bandage visible beneath his partially unbuttoned shirt. I had rehearsed what I would say during the walk from my room, but when those gray eyes fixed on me with such intensity, all my carefully planned words evaporated, and I found myself speaking from instinct instead. "I'll stay," I said, remaining standing rather than taking the seat he gestured toward, because I needed whatever small advantage height could give me. "But on my terms. I'm not your prisoner. I'm your ally. Temporarily." Something flickered in his expression that might have been surprise or approval, or both, and he leaned back in his leather chair with the slight smile of someone who was used to people doing exactly what he wanted but had not expected it from me. "Temporarily," he repeated, and the way he said the word made it clear that neither of us believed it. "Of course." I crossed my arms, holding my ground even though every instinct told me to flee from the way he was looking at me, from the heat that seemed to build in the air between us whenever we occupied the same space. "I want security arranged for my apartment and my clinic," I continued. "Not because I'm asking for your protection, but because I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of my involvement with you." "Already done," Dante said, pulling up something on his laptop and turning the screen toward me. "Your apartment building now has cameras on every entrance, and 2 of my men living in the unit across from yours. Your clinic has a new security system and armed response service. Your roommate and your clinic colleagues believe you're dealing with a family emergency out of state." The efficiency with which he had already moved to secure every aspect of my life should have angered me, but instead I felt a strange relief flooding through my chest, the relief of not having to carry the weight of worry alone, of having someone capable take action while I had been focused on keeping him alive. "I'll continue treating your wound and provide whatever medical assistance you need," I said, forcing myself to maintain the professional distance that was rapidly eroding with every interaction. "In return, I want transparency. No more surprises, no more decisions made about my life without my input." Dante stood and moved around the desk with that predatory grace that made my pulse quicken, and suddenly he was close enough that I could smell his cologne, could see the golden flecks in his gray eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You have my word," he said quietly, and then his hand came up to cup my cheek in a gesture that was becoming dangerously familiar. "Welcome to the family, Mia Chen, even if it's only temporary." The news reached us over breakfast 3 days later, Dante's phone buzzing with an urgency that made him tense before he even looked at the screen, and I watched his face transform from the almost relaxed expression he had been wearing to something cold and lethal as he read whatever message had come through. He stood without a word and walked to his study with me following, because something in his body language told me this concerned me too. And when he turned on the television mounted on the wall, I saw my clinic, or what was left of it, on every news channel. The building was a smoking ruin, yellow caution tape cordoning off the rubble, while firefighters continued to spray water on hot spots that still smoldered in the morning light. And the news ticker at the bottom of the screen made my knees buckle with words I could not fully process. One dead in apparent gas explosion at downtown Free Clinic, victim identified as Marcus Rodriguez, nurse practitioner working late. Marcus was dead. Marcus with his terrible jokes and his dedication to serving patients who had nowhere else to go. Marcus who had covered my shifts 100 times and never asked for anything in return, and I was standing in a mansion surrounded by luxury while he had been blown apart in the clinic where I should have been working. I felt Dante's presence behind me before his hands settled on my shoulders with surprising gentleness, but I shook him off and moved closer to the television as if proximity could somehow change what I was seeing. "Marcus is dead because I treated you," I said, my voice breaking as grief and guilt crashed over me in waves that threatened to pull me under. "This is my fault. He died in my place." "Marcus is dead because the Columbos are animals," Dante said, his voice carrying a coldness that made me turn to look at him, and what I saw in his gray eyes was fury barely leashed beneath iron control. "This is why I need that USB to reach the FBI. This is why they need to be destroyed." The screen changed to show a closer shot of the wreckage, and I could see something spray-painted on the wall of the adjacent building, words in red that made my blood turn to ice. "Moretti, surrender the drive or more will die." They had bombed my clinic, killed my colleague, destroyed the one place where I had felt like I was making a difference in the world, and they had done it to send a message to the man standing behind me, whose warning had saved my life even as it had cost Marcus his. I turned to face Dante fully, and saw him, watching me with an intensity that suggested he was waiting for me to blame him, to run, to break under the weight of this new horror, but instead I felt something hardening inside my chest, something that felt dangerously like the same cold rage I saw reflected in his eyes. "When do we take the USB to the FBI?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and determined in a way it had never been before. Elena had brought boxes containing my belongings from the apartment, things salvaged before Dante's security team had moved in, and I was sorting through them with mechanical efficiency when my fingers brushed against something hard taped to the inside pocket of my medical bag. The USB drive was small and innocuous, the kind you could buy at any electronics store, but as I peeled it away from the fabric where it had been carefully secured with medical tape, I felt understanding dawn with the weight of a physical blow. Dante had hidden it there at the clinic, must have slipped it into my bag during one of those moments when I had been focused on treating his wound or dealing with Isabella or watching the armed men search the waiting room. And suddenly every interaction we had had since that first night took on a different light. I was holding the thing that had gotten Marcus killed, the thing the Columbos had bombed my clinic to find, the thing Dante had claimed was so important he needed FBI protection, and he had hidden it on me without my knowledge or consent, had turned me into an unwitting courier for evidence that made me a target. I found him in his study because of course he was always in his study, always working, always 3 steps ahead of everyone around him, and when I slammed the USB drive down on his desk, his expression did not change, did not show surprise or guilt, only a kind of resigned acknowledgement that I had finally discovered his manipulation. "You used me as a hiding place," I said, my voice shaking with fury and hurt, and something that felt dangerously close to admiration for the cold calculation it must have taken. Dante's gray eyes met mine without flinching, and he nodded once, accepting the accusation without trying to soften it. "I used you as a shield," he corrected. "The Columbos would never suspect the innocent nurse who treated me out of compassion. And I needed it hidden from my own people because there is a mole in my organization, someone feeding information to the Columbos about my movements and my plans." I stared at him across the expanse of his desk, this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who commanded an empire built on violence and secrets, and I understood with sudden clarity that he had been playing a game I had not even known existed from the moment I had agreed to treat him. "You could have told me," I said, but the anger was already draining away, replaced by a weary acceptance that in his world, trust was a luxury and survival required ruthlessness. "Would you have agreed to carry it?" "If I had asked," he countered, standing and moving around the desk toward me. "Would you have understood why it was necessary? Why you were the only person I could trust with it?" I looked down at the drive sitting between us, this tiny piece of technology that contained enough evidence to destroy an organization that had cost Marcus his life and put mine in danger. "I'm not innocent anymore," I said quietly. And when I looked up at Dante, I saw something like respect in his expression, something that acknowledged the transformation I had undergone since that rainy night when I had made the choice to help instead of call the police. The summons came through one of Dante's men late that evening, his face grim as he told me that Dante required my presence in the lower level of the estate, and something in his tone made my stomach clench with dread. Even before I followed him downstairs, I had not known existed into a part of the mansion that bore no resemblance to the elegant spaces above. The basement was all concrete and exposed pipes, and the kind of stark functionality that spoke of purposes I did not want to imagine. And there was Marco, the silent driver who had brought us from the clinic that first night, on his knees with his hands zip-tied behind his back, and blood already streaming from his nose. Dante stood before him in shirt sleeves with his gun held loosely at his side, and when he turned to acknowledge my entrance, his face was a mask of cold fury that made him look like a stranger. "I needed you to see this," he said to me, his voice devoid of inflection. "Needed you to understand what betrayal means in my world." Marco was crying, pleading in Italian, and even though I could not understand the words, I could hear the desperation in them, the terror of a man who knew he was about to die. Dante listened without expression, and then he raised the gun and fired once, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, and Marco crumpled to the concrete with a hole in his forehead and his eyes still open in permanent surprise. I heard myself make a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and my legs carried me backward until I hit the wall behind me, unable to look away from the spreading pool of blood, from the casual way Dante lowered his weapon, from the absolute lack of hesitation or remorse in his movements. "You just killed him without hesitation," I said when I could finally form words, my whole body shaking so violently my teeth chattered. Dante turned those gray eyes on me, and what I saw there was not the man who had held my hand through his fever or called me beautiful in his delirium, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "He betrayed us," Dante said, each word precise and final. "He told the Colombos where to find us at the clinic. He gave them the location of Isabella's safe house. He fed them information that got Marcus killed. Betrayal means death. That's the world I live in." "And the world you've pulled me into," I whispered, tasting, bile in my throat, unable to tear my gaze from Marco's body. Dante moved toward me, and I flinched, but he did not stop until he was close enough that I could see the flecks of blood on his shirt collar, close enough that I could smell gunpowder mixing with his expensive cologne. "Yes," he said quietly, "this is the world you're in now, and I need to know if you can live with it." I waited until the house was quiet, and the guards had completed their rotation before I slipped out through the French doors that led from my suite to the gardens, my heart pounding so hard I was certain someone would hear it and raise an alarm. The rain had started again, cold drops that soaked through my clothes within seconds, and I ran across the manicured lawns toward the perimeter wall, with no plan beyond getting away from the image of Marco's body, from the casual way Dante had ended a life, from the terrifying realization that I had been falling for a man who could kill without hesitation or remorse. I made it perhaps 50 yards before Dante appeared in front of me, as if he had materialized from the darkness itself, his shirt plastered to his body by rain and his face carved from stone. "If you leave, you die," he said, not touching me, but blocking my path with the solid wall of his presence. "I can't protect you out there." Maybe I don't want your protection, I shouted, trying to push past him and finding myself caught in arms that were gentle despite their strength. Maybe I don't want to be part of a world where you execute people in basements and expect me to just accept it. His hands framed my face and forced me to meet his eyes, those gray depths turbulent with emotions I could not name. You think I'm the monster, he said, his voice rough. But I'm the only thing standing between you and worse monsters. Marco's betrayal would have gotten you killed, Mia. Would have gotten Isabella killed. In my world, there are no second chances for traitors. I was crying now, great sobbing breaths that shook my entire body, and I could not tell if it was from fear or grief or the overwhelming confusion of wanting to run from this man while simultaneously wanting to stay in the circle of his arms. He pulled me against his chest, and I collapsed into him, my fists beating weakly against his shoulders in protest before my fingers curled into his wet shirt and held on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. I'm not afraid of you, I heard myself say against his chest, the words muffled but honest. I'm afraid of what I'm becoming. Afraid that I understand why you did it. Afraid that I'm not horrified enough. Afraid that I'm falling for you, and that terrifies me more than anything else. Dante's arms tightened around me, and I felt him press his face into my wet hair, his breath warm against my scalp. I know, he whispered, and there was something broken in his voice that matched the fractures spreading through my chest. God help us both, Mia, but I'm falling for you too. We stood there in the rain with guards watching discreetly from their posts and water streaming down our faces, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had passed some point of no return, that my old life was as dead as Marco lying in that basement, and that whatever came next would reshape me into someone I did not yet recognize. Dante's hands were still framing my face, and the rain continued to fall around us like a curtain separating this moment from the rest of the world. And when he spoke again, his voice was raw with an honesty that stripped away every defense I had left. I told myself I'd keep you safe and let you go, he said, his thumbs brushing away tears that mixed with rainwater on my cheeks. I was lying. I can't let you go, Mia. I can't watch you walk away knowing I'll never see you again, never hear your voice telling me to sit down before I pass out, never feel your hands steady and sure, even when you're terrified. This is insane, I whispered, but I was leaning into his touch, my body betraying what my mind still tried to resist. You're a criminal. You kill people. I just watched you execute someone in cold blood. I should be running as fast as I can in the opposite direction. Yes, he agreed, and one of his hands slid into my wet hair, tilting my face up toward his. Do you feel it too? This thing between us that makes no logical sense, that shouldn't exist but does anyway. Yes, I breathed, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. God help me, yes. He kissed me then, and it was nothing like I had imagined in the traitorous moments when I had allowed myself to imagine it. Nothing gentle or questioning, but desperate and claiming and full of all the violence and passion that defined him. His mouth moved against mine with the same intensity he brought to everything else, demanding a response I gave without hesitation, my hands fisting in his wet shirt and pulling him closer until there was no space between us at all. I could taste rain on his lips and feel the heat of his body despite the cold water soaking us both, and when his arms wrapped around me, I felt simultaneously safe and in the gravest danger I had ever faced, because this was the point where I chose him, chose this life, chose to become someone who could love a man with blood on his hands. The kiss deepened, and I made a sound against his mouth that might have been surrender or triumph, and his hand tightened in my hair as if he were afraid I might disappear if he loosened his grip. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together and the rain still falling around us in sheets, and I could see guards in my peripheral vision maintaining their discreet distance, but undoubtedly aware of what had just happened. "You're mine now," Dante said against my lips, not a question but a statement of fact, and I should have argued, should have protested the possessive claim, but instead, I found myself nodding. "And you're mine," I replied, surprising myself with the fierce certainty in my voice. "If I'm choosing this, if I'm choosing you, then it goes both ways." His smile was brilliant and unexpected, transforming his face into something young and almost carefree. And he kissed me again, softer this time, but no less claiming. "Deal," he murmured. And then he was leading me back toward the house with his arm around my waist, and I knew that everything had changed, that I had stepped fully into his world, and there would be no going back to the woman I had been before. The museum was closed to the public when we arrived 3 nights later, the grand entrance illuminated only by security lights that cast long shadows across marble floors and made the sculptures lining the halls look like frozen sentinels guarding ancient secrets. Dante had insisted I come despite the danger, had said that I deserved to see what my involvement had helped accomplish, and I stayed close to his side as we walked through galleries filled with priceless art toward the central rotunda where his FBI contact waited. Agent Sarah Chen was younger than I expected, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes that assessed both of us, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to judge her sources too harshly, and she stood beside a man I recognized from news coverage as the lead prosecutor on organized crime cases. "With this evidence," Agent Chen said after Dante had handed over the USB drive and she had verified its contents on a laptop, "we can bring down the entire Colombo operation, leadership, middle management, their trafficking networks, their money laundering infrastructure. This is everything we needed. And my family's cooperation will be noted," Dante said, and it was not a question, but a confirmation of terms already negotiated. "As agreed," the prosecutor replied, his tone suggesting this arrangement sat uncomfortably with him, but was necessary for the greater good. "The Moretti organization's assistance in this matter will be taken into account." I watched this exchange with growing understanding of just how complex Dante's world truly was, how he was not simply a criminal, but someone navigating between legal and illegal with the skill of a tightrope walker, using violence when necessary, but working towards something that looked remarkably like legitimacy. He had told me during the drive that his father had dreamed of transitioning the family business into legal enterprises, that the older generation had built an empire on blood, but the younger one wanted to build on something more sustainable, and I was seeing evidence of that vision in the careful negotiation happening before me. The museum around us felt appropriate for this moment. All these artifacts of human history preserved behind glass, violence and beauty existing side by side, just as they did in Dante himself. Agent Chen was explaining timelines for raids and arrests, talking about witness protection for anyone in the Moretti organization who might be targeted in retaliation, and Dante listened with that focused intensity I had come to recognize, asking sharp questions that showed he had thought through every angle. I found myself watching him in profile, this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, who killed when he deemed it necessary, but who was also trying to build something better. And I felt a surge of emotion that went beyond the physical attraction that had sparked between us in the rain. When the meeting concluded and we walked back through those shadowed galleries toward the exit, Dante took my hand and laced his fingers through mine, and the simple gesture felt more intimate than the desperate kiss we had shared, felt like a promise of partnership rather than just passion. We had just reached the top of the museum steps when the first shot shattered the night air, and suddenly Dante was moving, his body slamming into mine and taking us both down onto the marble stairs as bullets chipped the stone where we had been standing seconds before. His men materialized from positions I had not known they occupied, returning fire toward black vehicles that had appeared at the base of the stairs, and the cultured silence of the museum district erupted into a chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting, and the wail of sirens in the distance. Dante had positioned himself over me, his body a shield, and I could feel the tension in every muscle as he drew his own weapon and fired with lethal precision at shapes moving in the darkness below. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority, and I pressed myself against the cold marble and tried to make myself as small as possible while violence exploded around us. Something hot stung my arm and I cried out before I could stop myself, looking down to see blood spreading across the sleeve of my jacket where shrapnel from a ricochet had torn through the fabric and into my skin. Dante's head whipped toward me at the sound, and his face went absolutely white, his gray eyes wide and unfocused in a way I had never seen, and he was saying no, no, not again, his hands reaching for me with trembling fingers that did not match the steady aim he had demonstrated moments before. "I'm okay," I said urgently, grabbing his face with my uninjured hand and forcing him to look at me, to see me rather than whatever ghost his trauma had conjured. "It's superficial, Dante. I'm okay." His eyes struggled to focus on mine, and I could see him fighting his way back from wherever his mind had taken him, from the memory of Sophia dying in crossfire meant for him, and I held his gaze with everything I had. "I'm here," I said firmly, clearly, grounding him in the present. "I'm alive. I trust you. Come back to me." Something shifted in his expression, clarity returning like a light being switched on, and then he was moving again with that deadly efficiency, pulling me behind one of the marble columns that flanked the stairs, while his men continued to engage the Columbos below. The FBI agents had emerged from the museum with weapons drawn, and Agent Chen was on her radio calling for backup, and through it all, I held pressure on my bleeding arm and watched Dante work, saw the way he orchestrated the defense with hand signals and sharp commands, and I realized that my fear had transformed into something else entirely, into absolute trust that he would keep us both alive, that we would survive this together, just as we had survived everything else that had been thrown at us since that first rainy night in my clinic. Back at the estate, Elena had tried to insist on calling a doctor, but I waved her off and carried the medical supplies to what I no longer thought of as the guest suite, but simply as my room. And I was setting up to clean and close my own wound when Dante appeared in the doorway with an expression that mixed guilt and something deeper that I was beginning to recognize as fear of losing me. He leaned against the doorframe and watched in silence as I cut away my ruined jacket and shirt, exposing the gash that ran along my upper arm, deep enough to need stitches, but nowhere near as serious as his gunshot wound had been. I worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated hundreds of similar injuries, irrigating the wound and preparing the local anesthetic, and I could feel his eyes on me with an intensity that made my hands falter for just a moment before I forced them steady again. "You should go to a hospital," he said finally, his voice rough. "Let professionals handle this." "I am a professional," I replied, injecting lidocaine around the wound site with barely a wince. "And I understand now why you didn't go to the hospital that night. It's not cowardice, it's survival. Questions lead to police reports lead to investigations, and in your world, that's a luxury you can't afford." He moved into the room and sat on the edge of the bed where he could watch me work, his gray eyes tracking every movement of my hands as I began to suture the laceration with small, precise stitches. "You've learned too much," he said quietly, and there was something like regret in his voice. "I've ruined you, Mia. Turned you into someone who treats gunshot wounds in back rooms and patches herself up rather than seeking proper care." I looked up from my work to meet his gaze, and I felt something settle in my chest, a kind of certainty that I had been fighting since the moment he had pulled me down behind that examination table in my clinic. "No," I said firmly, tying off another suture. "You've woken me up." I was sleepwalking through a life that was slowly crushing me, working myself to exhaustion in a clinic that couldn't pay me enough to survive, watching people suffer because the system had failed them, and pretending that was enough. His hand came up to touch my face, his thumb tracing my cheekbone with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "And now?" he asked. "Now I'm wide awake, I said, returning to my stitching. Now I understand that the world isn't black and white, that good people sometimes do terrible things for the right reasons, and that I'd rather be here with you in this dangerous, complicated life than safe and alone in the small, quiet one I had before. I finished the last suture and bandaged the wound with professional competence, and when I looked up at Dante again, I saw respect and desire and something that looked dangerously like love in his expression, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together as equals rather than protector and protected. The call came at dawn, and I knew it was bad from the way Dante's entire body went rigid, his knuckles white around the phone as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end. And when he ended the call and turned to me, his eyes were chips of gray ice with murder burning beneath. "They have Isabella," he said, each word clipped and precise, and I watched him transform from the man who had held me gently while I stitched my own wound into something cold and lethal. "The Colombos took her from the safe house an hour ago, killed 3 of my men, and left a message that they want me in exchange for her life." I was already moving, pulling on clothes and tying back my hair with movements made efficient by years of preparing for emergencies. "I'm coming with you," I said, not making it a question. Dante's head snapped toward me, and I saw him about to argue, saw the protective instinct warring with the knowledge that I was no longer the frightened nurse he had pulled into his car that first night. "This isn't your fight," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You made it my fight when you pulled me into your life, and I'm choosing to stay in it. Isabella saved me that first night when those men came to the clinic. She distracted them so they wouldn't find us, and I won't abandon her now." Within 20 minutes, I found myself in what could only be described as a war room in a part of the estate I had never seen, walls covered with maps and surveillance photos, and men who moved with military precision as they checked weapons and communication equipment. Dante stood at the center of it all, issuing orders in that voice that expected instant obedience, and I watched him orchestrate this rescue operation with the same intensity he brought to everything else, saw the devotion in his men's faces as they prepared to follow him into what might be a suicide mission. He had changed into tactical gear that made him look every inch the dangerous man he was, and when he caught my eye across the room, I saw fear for me mixing with the rage he felt over Isabella's kidnapping. I had gathered medical supplies into a tactical bag Elena had produced from somewhere, trauma kit and IV fluids, and everything I might need if someone came back injured, and I was checking it for the 3rd time when Dante appeared at my side. "If anything happens," he started to say. "Nothing is going to happen," I interrupted, reaching up to touch his face. "We're going to get Isabella back, you're going to destroy the Colombos, and then we're going to figure out what comes next for us. Together." He pulled me against him in a fierce embrace that spoke of all the words we did not have time to say, and I felt his heart pounding against mine, and I knew that whatever happened next, I was exactly where I needed to be. The abandoned warehouse district rose out of the fog like something from a nightmare, all rusted metal and broken windows, and the smell of salt water mixing with decay, and I sat in the armored vehicle watching through bulletproof glass as Dante and his team moved into position with the silent efficiency of men who had done this before. He had kissed me hard before leaving, his hand tangling in my hair, and his gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that spoke of all the things we might not have time to say later, and now I watched that strikingly handsome man in his late 20s move through the darkness in tactical gear, and felt my heart trying to climb out of my chest with every step that took him farther from me. The communications equipment crackled to life as his team confirmed positions, and I heard Dante's voice low and controlled, giving the order to breach. And then the night exploded with the sound of gunfire and breaking glass and shouted commands that I could not fully understand through the static. I pressed the headset closer to my ear, as if that could somehow bring me closer to him, my other hand gripping my medical bag so tightly my fingers ached, and I listened to the chaos unfold with a helplessness that was worse than any fear I had felt when I was the one in danger. Minutes stretched like hours, and I tracked the team's progress through their terse communications, heard Dante ordering suppressing fire and the confirmation that they had visual on Isabella, and then there was a burst of static and silence that made my blood run cold before his voice came through again. "Target secured," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice, the barely controlled violence. "Bringing her out now. I'm going in for Colombo." My hand found the transmit button before I had consciously decided to speak, and I heard my own voice emerging steadier than I felt. "Come back to me," I said, and it was both plea and command. "Always," Dante replied, and then his communication cut out as he moved deeper into the warehouse. I saw movement at the main entrance, and suddenly there was Isabella being carried by two of Dante's men, her face bloodied and her arm hanging at an unnatural angle, and I was out of the vehicle before anyone could stop me, running toward them with my medical bag and all my training focused on the woman who had become my friend. I worked on her in the back of the vehicle with shaking hands that remembered how to be steady when it mattered, stabilizing her arm and checking for internal injuries while the sounds of gunfire continued from inside the warehouse. And with every shot I prayed to a god I was not sure I believed in, that Dante would keep his promise, that he would come back to me, that we would have the chance to build whatever future was possible for a nurse and a mafia boss who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow made it work. I stayed with Isabella until Dante's voice came through the communications again, telling his men that he had Colombo cornered in the warehouse office, and despite every order to remain in the vehicle, I found myself moving toward the building with two of his men flanking me because I needed to see this end, needed to witness the conclusion of the nightmare that had started in my clinic and had cost so many lives. The warehouse interior was a maze of shipping containers and broken equipment, and I followed the sound of voices to a glass-walled office on the second level where I could see Dante standing with his weapon trained on an older man, who I recognized from surveillance photos as Vincent Colombo, patriarch of the family that had killed Marcus and bombed my clinic and stolen Isabella. I stayed in the shadows, where Dante could not see me and order me away, close enough to hear every word that passed between them, and I watched as Colombo tried to negotiate with the cold calculation of a man who had spent his life trading in human misery. "You've destroyed everything I built," Colombo said, his voice carrying the rage of someone who saw his empire crumbling. 40 years of work, of connections, of power, and you've torn it down in weeks." "No," Dante replied, and his voice held a satisfaction that was terrifying in its completeness. "You destroyed it when you killed Sofia, when you killed innocent people like Marcus Rodriguez, when you built your fortune on trafficking and suffering. This is just the reckoning." Through the glass walls I could see the last of the gunfire ending as Dante's men secured the perimeter, could see red and blue lights approaching in the distance as the FBI arrived with their tactical teams, and I understood that Dante had orchestrated this entire confrontation to happen exactly where and when he wanted it. "You recorded this," Colombo said, realization dawning on his weathered face. "This whole conversation." Dante's slight smile was colder than anything I had seen from him. "Every word," he confirmed. "And the FBI is already en route with warrants based on the evidence I provided. Your trafficking operation, your money laundering, your murders, all of it documented and ready for prosecution." Colombo's hand moved toward his waistband, and time seemed to slow as I saw the gun emerging, saw Dante's weapon tracking the movement, saw the moment when Colombo made the choice to go down fighting rather than face justice in a courtroom. The shots came almost simultaneously, but Dante was faster, his training and youth giving him the edge, and Colombo fell backward through the glass wall in a shower of crystalline fragments that caught the emergency lights like falling stars. I ran to Dante before the echo of gunshots had faded and found him standing amid the destruction with Sophia's ghost finally laid to rest in his eyes, and when he turned to me and pulled me against him, I felt the tremor in his body that spoke of 3 years of grief and rage finally released, and I knew that whatever came next, we would build it together on the foundation of everything we had survived. I saw Columbo's gun come up even as he fell backward, and I was screaming Dante's name before the shot rang out, before I saw him stumble and press his hand to his side where blood was already spreading across his tactical vest, before his knees buckled and he went down hard on the concrete floor amid the shattered glass. Time fractured into slow motion as I ran toward him with my medical bag, ignoring the shouts of his men telling me to stay back, ignoring everything except the sight of him bleeding on the warehouse floor in a grotesque echo of that first night when he had been brought to my clinic. I dropped to my knees beside him, and my hands were already moving, already ripping open his vest to expose the wound high on his left side. And the professional detachment I had relied on for 6 years of nursing shattered completely when I saw how much blood there was, how his face had gone pale, how those gray eyes that had pinned me with such intensity were struggling to focus. "You don't get to die," I said fiercely, pressing gauze against the wound with all my strength, while my other hand fumbled for supplies in my bag. "I didn't save you that night just to lose you now." His hand came up weakly to touch my face and left a smear of blood across my cheek. "You're supposed to be safe," he whispered, his voice rough with pain. "Supposed to be in the vehicle." "I'm supposed to be with you," I snapped back, blinking away tears that threatened to blur my vision as I worked. "Now shut up and let me work." The chaos of the warehouse faded away until there was nothing but him and me and the steady flow of blood I was trying to control, my training warring with the panic that clawed at my chest every time his breathing hitched. I could hear sirens approaching and knew that FBI medics would arrive soon, but soon might not be fast enough, and I was not going to lose him. Not after everything we had survived, not when we had finally found something worth fighting for. I started an IV line with shaking hands that remembered how to be steady when it mattered most, pushing fluids and calling for his men to bring the tactical stretcher. And all the while, I kept talking to him, telling him about the future we were going to have, the life we would build together, the way I was going to make him pay for scaring me like this. His fingers curled around mine with surprising strength, and when his eyes found my face, there was something in them that looked like wonder mixed with the pain. "I love you," he said clearly, and it was the first time either of us had spoken those words aloud. "I love you too," I replied, not caring that his men could hear, not caring about anything except keeping him alive. "So you're going to stay with me. Do you understand? You're going to live through this because I refuse to accept any other outcome." The private hospital wing that belonged to the Moretti family was nothing like the emergency rooms where I had trained, all soft lighting and actual artwork on the walls and equipment that was state-of-the-art rather than perpetually on the verge of breaking down. And I sat in a chair pulled as close to Dante's bed as possible with my hand wrapped around his where it lay on the pristine white sheets. The surgery had taken 4 hours, and the surgeon had assured me that the bullet had missed anything vital, that he would recover fully, with time and rest. But I could not shake the image of him bleeding out on that warehouse floor, could not stop replaying the moment when I thought I might lose him before I had the chance to build a life with him. Isabella appeared in the doorway with her arm in a proper cast now and her bruises darkening, but her eyes clear and grateful, and she moved to stand on the other side of Dante's bed with a tenderness that spoke of years of sibling devotion. "He's never let anyone this close," she said quietly, looking at me across his sleeping form. "Not even Sophia, not really. She was the woman he thought he should marry, the alliance that made sense for the family. But you're different. You see him, all of him, and you chose to stay anyway." I felt tears burning behind my exhausted eyes and blinked them away because I had cried enough in the past 12 hours to last a lifetime. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Be with someone in this world, navigate the violence and the danger and the constant fear that something will happen to him or to me or to the people we care about." Isabella reached across to squeeze my shoulder with her good hand, and her smile was sad and understanding. "Neither did I," she said. "When Dante rescued me from Antonio, I thought I could never trust anyone again, never feel safe, never build anything real from the ruins of what my life had been. But love makes us brave, Mia. It makes us strong enough to face things we never thought we could survive." Elena arrived with a tray of food I had no appetite for, but she set it down with the maternal insistence that I had come to associate with her presence. And then she was smoothing Dante's hair back from his forehead with a gentleness that reminded me he was not just the dangerous man who commanded an empire, but also someone who had been loved and cared for since childhood. Dawn was breaking through the windows, painting the room in shades of pink and gold, and I watched the light slowly illuminate Dante's face as his breathing remained steady and strong, and I felt something settle in my chest that might have been peace, or might have been the bone-deep certainty that I had found exactly where I belonged, even if it was in the most unlikely place imaginable. Dante's eyes opened on the second morning after surgery, and the first thing he did was search for my face as if he needed to confirm I was real and not some fever dream. And I saw relief flood through his expression before something more complex took its place. Something that looked like resignation mixed with hope. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice still rough from intubation but gaining strength. "The FBI deal went through. With Colombo dead and the evidence I provided, they're granting me immunity in exchange for testimony against the remaining Colombo associates and cooperation in dismantling their trafficking networks. I'm taking the family legitimate, Mia. Real estate development, import-export without the illegal cargo, investments in businesses that don't require violence to maintain." His hand tightened around mine, and I saw something vulnerable in those gray eyes that always saw too much. "Which means you have a choice now. A real choice without the threat of the Colombos hanging over you. I can set you up with enough money to start over anywhere you want. New identity if you need it. Complete freedom from this world and from me." My heart stuttered in my chest because he was offering me exactly what I had thought I wanted that first night when he had pulled me into his car. The chance to reclaim my old life or build a new one far away from danger and violence, and the constant awareness that loving him meant accepting risk. But as I sat there in the morning light streaming through the hospital windows, I realized that my old life felt like something that had belonged to a different person entirely, someone smaller and safer and infinitely lonelier than the woman I had become. "I can't promise safety," Dante continued, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. "I can't promise normal. There will always be people who remember what my family was, who might try to use you to get to me. But I can promise I'll love you until my last breath, that I'll protect you with everything I have, that every day I wake up next to you will be a gift I never thought I deserved after Sophia died." That night at the clinic, I said, leaning forward so our faces were close enough that I could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, "You told me to shut off the lights and don't leave. I thought it was a command, a threat, another way you were taking control of my life without asking." His thumb traced circles on my wrist where my pulse was hammering, and I saw him waiting for me to finish, hardly breathing. "But now I understand it was something else," I continued. "It was the moment everything changed, the moment I stepped into your world and you stepped into mine. And I'm choosing not to leave, Dante. I'm choosing you and this complicated, dangerous, beautiful life we can build together. I'm choosing to stay." 6 months later, I stood in our penthouse kitchen, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, spread below like scattered diamonds. And I was bandaging a minor cut on Dante's hand that he had gotten doing something mundane like opening a bottle of wine. And the domesticity of the moment made me smile in a way that would have seemed impossible during those first terrifying days, when I had thought of him only as my captor and myself as his unwilling prisoner. "You're surprisingly accident-prone for a mafia boss," I said, applying antibiotic ointment with the automatic precision of 6 years in nursing, and I felt rather than saw his smile. "Former mafia boss," he corrected, pulling me closer between his legs where he sat on the kitchen counter in a way that had become familiar and comfortable over the months we had spent learning each other in peace rather than crisis. Now I'm just a businessman who happens to have extensive security and a nurse for a fiancé. The engagement ring on my left hand caught the light as I secured the bandage, the emerald he had chosen because it matched my eyes surrounded by diamonds that probably cost more than my entire student loan debt, and I still sometimes caught myself staring at it in disbelief that this was my life now. "Lucky me," he murmured. And then his hands were spanning my waist and pulling me fully into his lap, his gray eyes holding that same intensity they had held since the night we met, but tempered now with contentment and the security of knowing I had chosen him freely. The medical clinic I ran in the renovated building that bore my name was funded entirely by legitimate Moretti enterprises, and I had hired Marcus's widow as my head administrator in a small attempt to honor his memory, and every day I treated patients who had nowhere else to go, and I knew I was doing exactly what I was meant to do. "Shut off the lights and don't leave," Dante said against my ear, his voice dropping to that low rumble that still sent shivers down my spine, and I found myself laughing at the phrase that had once been a command born of desperation and danger. "Those words used to terrify me," I admitted, my fingers threading through his dark hair that showed no trace of the fever that had almost claimed him or the bullet wound that had nearly made me a widow before I could become a wife. "And now," he asked, his lips finding the sensitive spot below my ear that he had learned made me melt against him. "Now they sound like home," I whispered, and I kissed him there in our kitchen with medical supplies still scattered on the counter because I had brought them home from the clinic, with his security team discreetly monitoring the perimeter, with the life we had built together against all odds stretching out before us full of possibility and promise and the kind of love that came from truly seeing someone at their worst and choosing them anyway.